So brickwork can be a challenge when you're building a structure kit, but I'm going to show you some simple techniques that'll work to create a brick pattern, create some mortar, and then do a little bit of weathering. And we're going to do it using this Hydrocal kit. Hydrocal is plaster basically, but it's just a little denser and it has better detail. So we're going to show you how to assemble this and join up the walls and paint and weather the brickwork. Before we do that though, please make sure you subscribe down below so we can keep making you more videos, and let's get to it. So the first thing we need to do is add some bracing. This is just a corner brace for a gluing edge. It's not so much about the walls warping, but it'll make it easier to give it some more gluing surface at the corners. So you could take some 1/8 inch strip wood, just cut it so it's flush with the height of the walls vertically, and glue it to the edge of the wall flush. So if you have any rough edges, you can use a razor blade just to knock down any jagged edges of plaster. So always do a test fit before you glue the walls together. You can see here there's a slight gap, which is not too big a deal. We can either fill that in with plaster or we could just sand down some of it to make it a little easier. So we're going to take some 220 grit sandpaper. And just make a very, very light pass, because the sandpaper will take away a lot of material very quickly if you're not careful enough, and then do another test fit. And you can see the gap is a little better. So you can use white glue, but I like to use yellow wood glue. It's a little stronger. You just have to be careful not to get any squeeze out coming out of the seams, because it does dry yellow and hard like plastic. So continue to test the walls as you work your way around the structure. Even if there is a gap, like I said, we will be able to fill it later, so it doesn't have to be perfect. So you can see here I used a little too much glue. You can just wipe it away with your finger. Now the top wall needs to be sanded at an angle so it can accommodate the roof. So again, just a few gentle passes on some sandpaper, and that should do the trick. So I'm going to use a couple of rubber bands here just to help things along with the drying process so the walls don't move around. So just use 2 rubber bands, make sure the walls are as flush as you can, and just let it dry thoroughly. So now we need to fill in these gaps at the wall joints. And now I'm just taking my brush and I'm putting it into some plaster, dry as powder, but I'm also going back and forth into water with my brush. And then I'm just using the brush to carry over the plaster and then fill in the joints. You will fill in some of the lines, but we're going to have to use a knife to cut and carve those. So don't be afraid to get a little plaster on there. Of course, you want to use as little as possible. So then just take your knife and use the lines that are already there as a guide to cut across the plaster you just filled into the cracks. And then continue bringing the plaster to the joint. You can go a little light. It's a lot easier to add it than remove it. So just go back and forth until you fill the joint as best you can. What's great is the plaster dries almost immediately because it's really thin. And then you could take your knife and just start using the horizontal brick lines to cut your lines in. Once you cut your lines in, you'll have a little bit of plaster dust. It's a lot easier to just use a brush to push it away, because if you push your finger, you'll just be pushing your plaster back into the mortar lines. So when we're painting Hydrocal walls, we want to take advantage of the fact that it's plaster, which means it'll absorb some paint like a stain, which will give us a more irregular look, just like real brick. So this is just an orange color. This is like a pumpkin acrylic craft paint mixed with a little bit of water. And you can see I'm not being very neat about it. It's pretty actually sloppy process, which actually makes it look better. I'm also dipping into a second color, which is red oxide. It's a little darker. This, you can see, gives it a little bit more variety in the look. So you want to use at least 2 colors. So now we need to color the stone base. You could use any kind of gray paint as an acrylic wash, but we're just using regular alcohol and ink. This is just isopropyl alcohol with a few drops of black drafting ink or India ink, and it's a nice wash to create this gray stone effect. Now we're going to use the same ink wash on the brick face. It gives it a little darker look. It kind of blends everything together, which is what we want to keep doing with every layer of weathering we do. And you can see how this kind of just kills the brightness of the color just a little bit. Makes it look a little bit more natural. So now, with a very small brush, start painting individual bricks. You want to use at least 4 colors. I'm using the same red oxide and that orange color I did earlier, but it's not a stain. I'm using them full strength. And I'm also using grimy black. I'm also using a pink flesh color. These are all colors that you'll see in brickwork. So now we need to paint the door frame. We're using a light green, which is the same color we'll be painting the door. So just paint the trim with a small brush. You don't have to be neat on the inside because we're going to paint that black in a moment. So now we're using grimy black. This is just so you don't see anything through the windows. Now we need to paint the header above the door. So we're just using this tan concrete color. So now we're going to use some white paint to dry brush the stonework on the bottom of the structure. If you haven't dry brushed before, basically you're putting some white paint on the brush and then removing about 90% of it on a piece of scrap like cardboard. And then we're not painting the stonework, we're just dragging it across so the white paint just hits the highlights and it'll bring out more of the detail. Now we need to seal the structure with flat dull spray to protect the coloring that we did before we apply the mortar. So this is the step that kind of ties everything together. Up until now it still looks a little strange. It needs to be blended in, and we're going to do that with our application of the mortar. And I'm using white tempera paint, which is kids' poster paint, and I'm putting my brush in water and thinning it out and kind of using it as a wash, but it's leaving behind the white paint in the mortar lines. And you can quickly see how it pulls everything together. So if you end up putting too much white paint onto the wall, just put your brush back into the cup with the water and you can thin down the paint. Now we can apply the same technique to the stone foundation. Now we can lightly brush on some tan weathering powder. This will give the effect of mud around the base of the building where it contacts the ground. Now we're using a darker brown to create some streaks down the side of the wall. And then use some of that same dark color where the brick meets the stone wall, and it'll separate the two to define one from the other. So that's it for our brick technique. Now let's just take you through the rest of the process of finishing this little structure.
So I hope you can see that it's not too difficult to do brickwork. It's just a few steps with the right materials. I hope you give it a try, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Come on, give it back. Let go. Good. Thank you.